What's up, everybody? This is Albert, he, him, his, and I'm back with another video. So, for this video, we're going to be talking about The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander. And I think this is another book that delves into the state system and prisons and police. So similar to Angela Davis, Our Prison's Obsolete, but this one is more contemporary. This one was published, I think, in 2010 or something. But for those who don't know, Michelle Alexander, I don't know if she still does civil rights, but she was a civil rights lawyer. She was a legal scholar, a professor. And she used to work for the ACLU, and she worked on their racial justice project. And then she left because she realized how much of the prison industrial complex is racist, how much it is racist. And now she is a well-renowned journalist, now a New York Times bestselling author with The New Jim Crow, and she had a lot of speaking engagements and stuff like that. She was in Ava DuVernay's 13th documentary, and I highly recommend anyone to watch that. So this one, we're going to be talking about the New Jim Crow, as I said, and boy, oh boy, this had like a lot of statistics and stuff like that. So Michelle Alexander did her research in this book and can tell you how um, the prison industrial complex and mass incarceration as we know it is the new racial caste system that we have today. And yeah, so we can get started on this. So she had an introduction before she went into the chapter, so it kind of like introduced like her realization of how ingrained racism, classism, and everything is ingrained into the prison industrial complex. So she first started out with this man named Jarvis Cotton and how he's not eligible to vote because he's a convicted felon. And then she talked about how the prison industrial complex, it's redesigned through colorblindness. So it's not like slavery and Jim Crow where it's explicitly black people are inferior. It's now conditions that are set in place in certain communities to funnel them into the prison system and being heavily policed. And then she went into the war on drugs and how we have these notions on the war on drugs and how it's supposed to be a tackle on the crack epidemic, which it wasn't. It was literally policing low income and urban areas, specifically communities of color and black communities, and how these laws are how they're coded into contributing to state sanctioned violence in black communities. And she said here, quite belatedly, I came to see that mass incarceration in the United States had in fact emerged as a stunningly comprehensive and well-disguised system of racialized social control that functions in a manner strikingly similar to Jim Crow. So we'll get into later how she says that it's the new Jim Crow, because it's just so many parallels within the system that makes you go, this is so familiar. We're literally in another system in this country. And she pretty much exposed the CIA and how crack is literally in certain areas. She said here, the CIA admitted in 1998 that guerrilla armies it actively supported in Nicaragua were smuggling illegal drugs into the United States, drugs that were making their way onto the streets of inner city black neighborhoods in the form of crack cocaine. The CIA also admitted that in the midst of the war on drugs, it blocked law enforcement efforts to investigate illegal drug networks that were helped to fund its covert war in Nicaragua. So this tells you how imperialism it contributed to the destabilizing communities at home. And she said the impact of the drug war has been astounding in less than 30 years. So these are some statistics that was amazing. The US penal population exploded from around 300,000 to more than 2 million, with drug convictions accounting for the majority of the increase. The United States is now the highest incarcerated rated in the world, dwarfing the rates of nearly every developed country, even surpassing those like Russia, China, and Iran. Yeah. And comparing it to Germany, 91 people are in prison for every 100,000 adults and children. But in the United States, the rate is roughly 8 times that. And it's 750 per 100,000. So that tells you um, the United States really has a thing with prisons and loves it so much. and she tells like how the justice system isn't broken. It's literally meant to do what it's supposed to do. She said these institutions create crime rather than prevent it, because the prisons, they don't solve issues regarding poverty and unemployment and broken families. So that's the crime itself, is the prisons. And she went into this critique of civil rights organizations and how they focus more on affirmative action, and there's no really discussion about criminal justice. And it and then she went into this conference and she talked about how they were talking about a lot of issues. They were talking about taxes, defense, immigration, agriculture, housing, banking, higher education, all that stuff, but there was no mention of prison reentry or criminal justice. And she was wondering, why is that? And we'll get into more why is that. and And then she said, the colorblind public consensus that prevails in America today, the widespread belief that race no longer matters, has blinded us. And excuse me, it's kind of ableist language, blinding, but to the realities of race in our society, and facilitated the emergence of a new caste system. So it shows you how it's not visible how racism is ingrained into this new caste system that we're in. Like, it literally makes things so easy for people to be racist, and to the point where you say you're not racist. and she said to think of the criminal And she said to think of the criminal justice system, the entire collection of institutions and practices that comprise it, not as an independent system, but rather as a gateway into a much larger system of racial stigmatization and permanent marginalization. So you can literally compare how people are convicted in prison and how people are treated during the eras of Jim Crow, and how it was in the peak of slavery too. And she defined mass incarceration not only to the criminal justice system, but also to the larger web of laws, rules, policies, and customs that control those labeled criminals both in and out of prison. So, cycle of incarceration. So, she's talking about the stigma once you get into the prison and the stigma once you get out of prison. So, we recognize that mobility may be difficult, but the key to our collective self-image is the assumption that mobility is always possible. So failure to move up reflects on one's character. So how people are incarcerated, they're put into an undercast. And the United States concept of upward mobility, you're literally in that category because you're incarcerated. Like, you don't get the opportunity to make mistakes because you've been incarcerated. And she also talked about how there's not analysis. You can't have an analysis of race without an analysis of class. So it also, yeah, she talks about how the system is based off of racism and classism. So, and she went into like black exceptionalism later on that. And then she went into how each chapter, the gist of each chapter and stuff like that. So chapter 1 is the rebirth of the caste. And she talked about how these racial caste systems being slavery, segregation and Jim Crow, and now mass incarceration in the prison industrial complex, which we are really going in now. And she talks about how probably once we get rid of mass incarceration in the prison industrial complex, how there might be a new racial caste system. Who knows what would that be? And there's always, when slavery was about to end, there were already laws in place that would launch Jim Crow. And when Jim Crow was about to end, there was already some seeds planted for mass incarceration. And she talked about the birth of slavery, how we didn't know what race, we didn't conceptualize race to the point we are now, and how there's these notions that African Americans are inferior to white people and white supremacy came out of it. And colonialism and imperialism, how white people went to African civilizations and think they were acting weird. They called them primitive savages and stuff like that. And they saw their ability to be useful and resources that they can extract from Native Americans, and killed Native Americans, and then started to enslave Africans. And there is the United States history as we know it right now. And then she talked about and then she talked about Bacon's rebellion. So it was this white industrialist who's an abolitionist, and then he led a slave revolt and a slave rebellion, and it led to planters and plantation owners to import even more slaves, because it's raising consciousness within slaves that they shouldn't be in this position. It was a mass mobilization effort. And then they imported more slaves, then do more colonizing, and then they try to appeal to even more plantation owners, and try to justify their whiteness and their superiority to the slaves. So it's this history with the white elites try to appeal to poor working white people to affirm their whiteness to the point where they feel superior for it, that it led to slavery and systems that put African Americans in an inferior position. And then she talked about the establishment of slave patrols to block black slaves from poor whites in alliance. So there's this thing called slave patrols that were happening during slavery, and that led into police officers. And that is trying to block alliances between and block solidarity between black slaves and poor working whites. So, because they're both in a system that exploited them both, and these slave patrols are a system of social control, and then racism attached to it is put why black slaves were in the position they were now. And then she talked about history regarding federalism, the U.S. Constitution, all men are created equal, that irony and hypocrisy that they never kept blacks in mind when they wrote that. And the Electoral College is, for those who don't know about the Electoral College, it's because of slavery why it happened, because slaves were considered like 3/5 of a human being back then. And then Electoral College, it gave plantation owners more power in their vote. So that's how that started. and then and then Alexander talked about the notion of white supremacy and how it's promoted through structures and institutions. So victors write the history. So how our education functions, what's being preached in white churches compared to black churches, all types of institutions that are in our societies, and police. And then she talked about white fragility in the South after emancipation that led to the black codes. So when all the slaves in the South were free after emancipation, there was this fragility from white plantation owners, like, okay, we still need to put some sort of sense of control to these Negroes. And that's how the black codes were launched. So the black codes, a lot of them consisted of stuff like vagrancy laws. So you're literally criminalized if you're refusing to work. Um, what was another one? It was yeah. So the main purpose of the codes was to control the freedmen, and question of how to handle convicted black lawmakers was very much at the center of the control issue. So some of the black codes, there were some legislation that was legislative battles that were going on in Congress, and that led to the 15th Amendment, which yeah, it prohibited states from imposing from inequality and stuff, like blacks can vote and stuff like that. And then she also talked about the Freedmen's Bureau, which we also talked about, and W.E.B. Du Bois is the soul of black folk. And a lot of black people, they were in political office, they were in businesses and education because of the 15th Amendment, but there was a loophole within the 15th Amendment. She said, notably absent from the 15th Amendment, for example, was language prohibiting the states from imposing educational, residential, or other qualifications for voting, thus leaving the door open to the states to impose poll taxes, literacy tests, and other devices to prevent blacks from voting. So you can vote, but there's going to be some barriers for you to vote. So that's literally what led to Jim Crow. So that's a segue into segregation. And she talked about how the fragility from white plantation owners and the white elites, how that turned into the Ku Klux Klan. And those also turned into lynchings, and those also turned into race riots. So it's literally put black people in their place. And she said their campaign to redeem the South was reinforced by a resurgent Ku Klux Klan, which fought a terrorist campaign against Reconstruction governments and local leaders, complete with bombings, lynchings, and mob violence. Yeah, and then she talked about the convict leasing and convict labors, how there were harsh conditions, and Angela Davis argued that convict leasing is even worse than slavery because you get even lower wages and stuff like that. And then there's the conservative and liberal appeals, and then that's what the 13th documentary hinted. It was called The Southern Strategy, to appeal to white conservatives and white liberals, and how that contradicted with the radical populism that was going on during Reconstruction. Yeah, and then Alexander noted the differences between liberalism and conservatism, and she said the liberal philosophy of race relations emphasized the stigma of segregation and the hypocrisy of a government that celebrates freedom and equality yet denies both on accounts of race. So it's like we're all in the same place when we're not in the same place. Like we can't be equal. We're just inherently in different positions, and we can't be equal right now. And then the conservative philosophy attracted wide support, and it was based on this individualism philosophy of pull yourself up by your bootstraps to work and stuff like that. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. We should be focusing on ourselves. And then there was the radical populism that was going on, and a lot of African Americans back that time, they were in favor of radical populism because it appealed to their interests and class solidarity and racial solidarity. And then the Populist Party, it was like it was like the Green Party and the Communist Party and every third party. It wasn't as popular as now, and that's how we got into Democrats and Republicans right now, because it's a two-part. We live in a two-party system that's like based on corporate capitalism and stuff like that. And then she said how the upper class used segregation to reduce class unity. So same with the slave patrols back then. And then that's how police were enforcing segregation laws and stuff like that. And then let me see, she got a definition for Jim Crow. But she said Jim Crow was a reformed title of slavery. So that's pretty much what it is. And then she talked about the academic discourse of when slavery ended. And she talked about Brown versus Board of Education and how they didn't really like say during in academia, when did Jim Crow really end? And everyone kind of signified Brown versus Board of Education was pretty much the end of Jim Crow, when it really wasn't, because it took about 10 years for states to actually be enforced integration and stuff like that. Like we were still segregated even after segregation was considered unconstitutional. So think about that. And then she talked about how Jim Crow kind of dwindled down because the NAACP, there was a lot of legal victories. There was the Civil Rights Act of 1960, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and Civil Rights Act of 1968, and stuff like that. And how we won a lot of things through litigation. So that's kind of what influenced Alexander to become a lawyer too, because of civil rights lawyers, and how there was a lot of progress when we were taking things to the courts. And then there was this World War II imagery that happened because of because Hitler was unpopular and stuff like that. So it was this we're past racism. Racism is finally done. We're integrated now and stuff like that. I have a black friend. That's when like white people made all those excuses to be racist and stuff like that. And then KKK was still around even after that. Like no one was talking about it, how the KKK is still and is not considered a terrorist organization and stuff like that. And then there were white councils to because white supremacy is so ingrained that white people created organizations and councils out of it. There were white citizens councils and communities. And she talked about how the civil rights was a radical time. It was like a revolution of it was literally the revolution of the 60s. And then she talked about I know Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., like before he died, he had like a focus on class. Like when he passed and when he was killed in Memphis, Tennessee, he was there in solidarity with black sanitation workers. So he became more radical in his politics, and he was against Vietnam, the Vietnam War and stuff like that. And then that's when white people were like, all right, King, you got to go. and then there were Then there was Richard Nixon, who talked about law and order, how after the Civil Rights Act, like everyone was talking about right now, how the Civil Rights was a victory because everyone was peaceful, which was not the case because there were a lot of police harassment in peaceful protests. Like, first of all, Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated and he was killed. I know white people beat him up and stuff like that. So this idea that we got through things through peace and nonviolence is false, because there was indeed violence that happened in order to get these victories. Like the Civil War, and slavery was ended because of a civil war. Like, you have to think about that. And and then she talked about how Nixon kind of made crime such an issue and that should be prioritized that the media paid attention to it and sensationalized it. That's when we got all these propaganda shows about police and how the villains in these cop shows tend to be rebels and stuff like that. And then and then crime became and crime sensationalized as a civil rights consequence. So we gave black people rights. Now, why are y'all acting out? And that turned into crime. And it became a civil rights issue rather than an unemployment issue, which is what Alexander gave opportunity to reframe the conversation on criminality and stuff like that. And then that's when laws, policies, and stuff like that, and the media, how the criminality is now associated with blackness because there was so much media imagery of black people participating in crime and getting arrested and stuff like that. Hence the civil rights movement. A lot of people were protesting for our rights to vote and got arrested and stuff like that. And then she talked about how there were even some black people that supported punishment, these respectability politics people that were in support of punishment and harsh laws and these Rockefeller drug laws. And it was insane. And she talked more about the Southern strategy. So this is how she defined the Southern strategy: the success of law and order rhetoric among working class whites and the intense resentment of racial reforms, particularly in the South, led conservative white Republican analysts to believe that a new majority could be created by the Republican Party, one that included the traditional Republican base, the white South, and half the Catholic blue-collar vote of the big cities. Some conservative political strategists admitted that appealing to racial fears and antagonisms was central to this strategy, though it had to be done surreptitiously. So, pretty much, that's how it became a political strategy for Republicans to gain office, and even some Democrats for to get into politics and political office, because there were even some Democrats that participated in the crime discussion and participated in these racist policies because they tried to. It was this political competition between Democrats and Republicans on who can be tougher on crime, hence Bill Clinton. And then there was this culture poverty quote by sociologist Catherine Beckett. The alleged misbehaviors of the poor were transformed from adaptations to poverty and had the unfortunate effect of reproducing it into character failings that accounted for poverty in the first place. The social pathologies of the poor, particularly street crime, illegal drug use, and delinquency, were redefined by conservatives as having their cause in overly generous relief arrangements. Black welfare cheats, hence, because Ronald Reagan got popular off of welfare queens, which is racist, classist, and sexist portrayal and stereotype of of poor working black women, and their dangerous offspring emerged for the first time in a political discourse and media imagery, hence crack babies. Yep, yep, and yep. So that was pretty much the gist of chapter 1, because it was talking about how we got from the civil rights movement into the racial caste system that we are in right now. And then chapter 2 is called The Lockdown. And she talked about propaganda on television shows. I forgot which show she was talking about on here. She talked about Law and Order. Law and Order, CSI, cops, all that stuff, how they portray them criminals and stuff like that. They didn't give them they think criminals they only chose to do crime, when instead there was conditions set in place for them to conduct crime. And then she talked about drugs were the driving force of mass incarceration. So she talked about the war on drugs, the drug war, and how it literally funneled people into the prison system. And then she talked about the Fourth Amendment, which is illegal searches and seizures, and then how it made exceptions for police discretion. So discretion for police officers allowed racial bias to get in the way, and why a lot of black people were arrested for drug charges and stuff like that, or suspicion of drug charges. Sometimes they didn't even have any crack or anything. And then she talked about state surveillance and how police, there was so much funds going towards police and law enforcement that they're militarized. Like, I know in Baltimore, when Freddie Gray uprising, Baltimore police, they had tanks, and it was like, wow, a lot of taxpayer dollars went into that. And that led to and then because of police discretion, police were able to coerce people into giving them consent to strip and to search and seize them. And one example is traffic violations and stuff like that. Are police really going for traffic violations, or are they really looking for drugs and stuff like that? Are they suspicious of a person going to drugs? Like, they can literally, if they literally see a black person in a car, and if they didn't make a right turn signal, probably in behind the white lines when they're about to make a turn, a police officer can stop that person for a traffic violation, and even speeding or something like that. Like, a lot of people, it's literally your police for doing anything that's you probably didn't intend to do. And Alexander talked about this thing called Operation Pipeline, which was a program that was facilitated by law enforcement that I think Reagan approved. And she said officers learn, among other things, how to use a minor traffic violation as a pretext to stop someone, how to lengthen a routine traffic stop and leverage it into a search for drugs, how to obtain consent from a reluctant motorist, and how to use drug-sniffing dogs to obtain probable cause. So that's literally how you get innocent people into prison. It's literally a program funded for it. And she talked about how law enforcement, they got these financial incentives, and Reagan gave so many grants to state and local law enforcement to focus on drug crimes. Like, it's an insane amount of money that he gave them. Like, I think it was even in the billions, but it was literally like, more funding was put into that than education, jobs, infrastructure, industrialization, and public transportation and anything that would have helped communities to thrive and prosper. But instead, you're putting it into drugs. You're not even rehabilitation. You're only criminalizing drugs, and then SWAT SWAT teams and no knock warrants were established, and military equipment access to the Pentagon. So Reagan literally made a war out of this. Like he literally got military equipment and tried to declare war on urban low income communities of color and black communities. And SWAT teams, they used to be, they're not usually used for crimes. It's usually for um, terrorism and stuff like humanitarian aids and stuff like that. But it's to the point where even they're armed and militarized. And law enforcement. So this is the crazy part. So even law enforcement, they can go to your house, arrest you for something they suspect you of, and they can accumulate assets of suspected drug crimes. So you can be innocent, and say you have like a family member that had a drug problem and stuff like that. They had an addiction or something like that. They can arrest your family member and you and take your whole house, and they can use it for their operations, the funds, the assets from their house. So that is literally like, you literally can't win if you get arrested. And then police became gangs because they started to there was a lot of cash seizing. There was a lot of incentives that Reagan gave police to arrest people for drugs or suspected of drugs. And police even planted drugs. Like, I know Baltimore police, I saw a video clip of literally a Baltimore cop planting drugs. Like, you probably don't even have drugs in your car, but when a police officer searches, they can literally plant a drug and say, "Oh, you got some drugs. You need to go to jail," and stuff like that. So it's literally an operation, an orchestration for people to get locked up. And then she talked about the legal misrepresentation of poor people because of lack of funding for public defender offices. So for those who don't know about the legal atmosphere, prosecutors have so much power. Like, it's literally if you have a racist prosecutor, well, that is an argument about prosecutors and how it's conducted and how police and stuff like that. But they can literally pick a juror. They pick the juries, and they can literally discriminate on a juror. It's called peremptory strikes. So they can not pick a jury because they feel like there's some bias between that juror and the defendant, or their hair is too long. So you can get into black hair and stuff like that. And that's why a lot of defendants, they find themselves in all white juries that 9 times out of 10 they'll be guilty of for a crime they probably didn't even commit and stuff like that. So there is prosecutors also have the power through mandatory minimum sentences. So drugs, people literally go to jail for drugs for 5 to 10 years, I think, and judges have no power over these drug sentences, and that leads to a lot of manipulation for plea bargaining. So prosecutors, they can charge you for a lot of things, as many things as they can think of at the top of their head, to make sure that they get their job done. And witnesses, some of them can. You really think people in witness stand, they always tell the truth? think again. Because some witnesses, they get paid, they get bribed and stuff like that to fulfill interests and favors from prosecutors and stuff like that. Like you'll be fooled to think that's the case. and And then the Supreme Court, they said they found drug punishments not in violation with the Eighth Amendment, which is cruel and unusual punishment. So Supreme Court, you can't even win through them. And then she talked about a little bit about the three strikes laws by Bill Clinton, how that leads to even more punishment because once you get the third strike, you're in prison for life and there's nothing that can save you. And even if all of your strikes are not violent and stuff like that. And then she went into how a lot of judges, even they know that this system is unjust and is unfair for people that are poor that probably couldn't afford a lawyer, and black people and stuff like that. And literally she said, once you're a felon, you can be legally discriminated against because you're a felon. And that leads to the parallels to the inferiority that black people have during Jim Crow and slavery. It's a cycle of incarceration that goes on. We'll explain more in chapter 4, and how a lot of things that happen during your parole. You'll get incarcerated for violating parole and stuff like that. Once you miss a parole meeting, you get incarcerated even longer. You get to be electronically monitored and stuff like that. So you get even more surveillance. And Alexander said, merely reducing prison terms does not have a major impact on the majority of people in the system. It is the badge of inferiority, the felony record, that relegates people for their entire lives to second-class status. So literally, black people were treated as second-class citizens throughout the United States. And once you're a felon, there's more of an excuse to treat you like you're in an inferior position in an undercaste. Like, it's hard for you to get a job once you're incarcerated. It's hard for you to gain education attainment. It's hard for you to, just bettering your life. But because of that stigma and that felon label, you don't get that opportunity. It's rare to get an opportunity, but it's very hard to get it. Yep, and she said the extraordinary increase in prison admissions due to parole and probation violations is due almost entirely to the war on drugs. So not even just through police, it's through parole proceedings and stuff like that that led to the war on drugs to be the racist catapult that it is right now, and the prison industrial complex is the way it is right now. And chapter 3 is the color of justice. So she talked about the racial analysis that went into the war on drugs and how it's racialized. So I think everyone knows there's the racialization. There's this stereotype of black people being crack addicts. And there's even a survey that was distributed about to people of what do they envision a drug criminal, and they envision it to be a young black man. Majority of them said it was a young black man. When black and white people, they do drug offenses at similar rates, and white people did probably do it even more. And people think of as an urban black person because of what they're fed into in the media and stuff like that, and the way laws are distributed by political officials. And then she talked about the racial disparities in drug use and dealing, and how enforcement and incarceration for drug use and drug dealing, there's a racial disparity there. So we all know black people get arrested more than white people for similar crimes. And And she said drug trafficking is similar and not higher in white communities. So it's like, why don't we have that narrative of white people when it comes to drugs? And that can lead to a socialization of anti-discrimination among police and prosecutors. So that they can literally code themselves to say that they're not racist when in fact they are. They can say you just look suspicious, and that's literally the culture we are. This colorblind, as you say, that we're in right now. And then Alexander wonders why a lot of violence in urban communities happen anyway. And then she hinted that a lot of people used kind of blame urban culture, so violence, gangster rap, and stuff like that. But she said there's no correlation between the violent crimes and incarceration, because violent crimes, they were declining, but the incarceration rates are going up. And that's because there was a focus on drug crimes, and there was no rehabilitation for for drug offenses, which should have been the focus. And then she talked about a little bit about unconscious bias, and she even went into colorism, how dark-skinned black men, they usually get sentenced and punished harder than light-skinned black men. And she went into some notable Supreme Court cases. There was a lot of Supreme Court discrepancies that happened within the conversation within the death penalty and stuff like that. I know it's becoming popular. Well, it's been popular, I would say, like since the 80s regarding the death penalty, that people say people need rehabilitation and another chance. They shouldn't have to succumb to death. And but some politicians, they use the Southern strategy to enable the death penalty to be a thing. I know with George W. Bush, H.W. Bush, he used the Willie Horton murder, the Willie Horton story to justify the death penalty, and how who was it, Michael Dukakis he was running against. That's how he won his election, when he used criminality and racism to win the presidency. And then the Supreme Court, there was this part in the Supreme Court where they weren't taking any racial discrimination cases because of colorblind culture. So they were denying any racial discrimination cases. And even if a defendant gets a guilty verdict, and the sentence probably isn't as harsh, it's probably like 3 years, prosecution could appeal and argue for harsher sentences. And that's the story of Edward Clary that she talked about in the book. And that showed in Armstrong versus United States, and how defendants seeking racial bias in prosecution. So when defendants, they spot that they have evidence that a prosecutor is racist, like the jury selection and stuff like that, when they get those type of records, it's literally a catch-22 and crack cocaine violations. And the Supreme Court said they're literally denying racism at that point. So it's literally upsetting. And then Alexander had some juvenile statistics. And she said, she talked about how we treat children, because juvenile corrections and juvenile punishment is it's harsher for black children compared to white children. And she said a study sponsored by the U.S. Justice Department and several of the nation's leading foundations, published in 2007, found that the impact of biased treatment is magnified with each additional step into the criminal justice system. African American youth accounting for 16% of all youth, 28% of all juvenile arrests, 35% of the youth waived to adult criminal court, and 58% of youth admitted to state adult prison. So black children that are in juvenile watch, they're more likely to go into adult prisons, which is like this the exonerated five, formerly the Central Park Five. How Corey Wise, he was so young, but he was in an adult prison. Who else was it? Yusef? It was one of them. Was also in an adult prison because they got that age because they were the oldest, so they were in adult prisons. And then talked about racism and jury selection, which is called peremptory strikes. You can literally strike a juror for long hair and stuff like that. And she also talked about how this correlates with jury service, because once you're a felon, you can't serve serve juries, and that's literally it's literally barriers that are put in place. So like if you're not registered to vote, you can't serve the jury, which happened a lot during the civil rights movement. And she correlate that to felon exclusion and how there are race neutral reasons to give you inaccessibility to jury service. And then Alexander went into hypersegregation and neglect leading to criminalization in ghettos. So, like, we're still segregated. Like, I live in Prince George's County, majority black community, and not a lot of white people here, but there's some. But there's we're very hypersegregated, and it can lead to racism to operate because you tend to neglect black communities. Like when Brown versus Board of Education happened, a lot of black teachers were laid off because the black kids were going into integrated schools. So it's literally a double-edged sword on how integration was working. Like black children got more educational opportunities, but black teachers, they were laid off and stuff like that. So it's literally a win-lose situation. And then Alexander said that there has been reform efforts that made the criminal justice system not as harsh, like the ban on chokeholds that were happening in Seattle and Los Angeles. Like, I know chokeholds were illegal and stuff like that, but police officers, even still today, they still use chokeholds, and they don't get punished for it. And she talked about in the context of immigration how illegal aliens and stuff like that, they come and steal our jobs. That rhetoric that's spewed around in conservative and right-wing circles, and how that's affirmed and leads to ICE criminalizing and putting a lot of people in detention centers and deporting them. Like, I think ever since ICE created, it was more deportations. Like, Obama was called deporter in chief because he deported more illegal undocumented immigrants than Bush and stuff like that. And the occupant in the White House, his rhetoric on immigration. And then she talked about stop and frisk, how that gained controversy, and how it was literally sexual harassment of people that are stopped. A lot of pedestrians that were stopped by police and violated their Miranda rights and Fourth Amendment rights, and that became let go. And then she was talking about how NYPD, New York Police Department, they use marijuana arrest as training and deterrence in order to do their jobs. So it's literally a hazing. It's literally a gang culture that happens in NYPD, especially. And then she talked about the case of crime suspicion databases and how a lot of people that are in those databases are Black people. And Alexander versus Sandoval, which is a case that allowed defendants to cite race discrimination, dealt with Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which paid attention to the data and determined ineffectiveness. So that's when the Supreme Court case finally paid attention to race discrimination cases. So they finally stopped denying, and I think it's also because different Supreme Court justices and stuff like that. And then mass incarceration was still immunized in court legal proceedings, and the prison